Okay, and Jeff, at this time, I'm going to let you go ahead and take the microphone, make your report. And today our discussion will be, it's not a lecture now, it's a discussion. And N5RTF will be using radio protocol, and it'll be giving time for identification, time for people to ask questions. So at this point, N5RTF, thank you for being here with us. Go ahead.
Okay, first, microphone check. Can everybody hear me?
I hear you well.
Good. Okay, I wanted to discuss, rather than a medical topic, wanted to discuss a technical topic today. Our sister radio service, GMRS. I don't know if y'all are familiar with it or been following it or even used it over the years, but I wanted to give sort of a current state of the art, as well as some historical information for people that may not have been exposed to GMRS in the past. GMRS is the General Mobile Radio Service. It is a licensed personal radio service based in the UHF band, which is our 440 band. It's up around 460, 462, 467. It shares spectrum with the unlicensed family radio service. Differs from ham radio. I probably have to change this. I checked this. There's now a fee for ham radio licenses. I didn't even know that. But they're both $35 for 10 years. GMRS requires no testing or proof of competence or ability to operate a radio. To prevent abuse of this, the operating frequencies for GMRS are extremely limited, 22 in number. They're channelized so that you can't move up and down in between channels, and you can't interfere with other channels if you use the equipment properly. And Part 95 type acceptance of the radios that you use is required. The radio has to be programmed to control bandwidth and transmitting power as it changes over the available frequencies. Repeaters are allowed, but only on 8 channels and only for GMRS. FRS cannot use repeaters. So what is it? It's conceptualized as a means of short-range communication for families, businesses, or persons enjoying outdoor recreational activities. The range without a repeater, if you look on advertising, you'll see they'll tell you 40 or 50 miles. We know from experience with 2 meters and 440 that this is really more a function of line of sight. If there's nothing in between you, from mountaintop to mountaintop, 50 miles is possible. 5 miles is more typical in a normal environment. The history, after World War II, radio was opened up again for civilian use, and someone at the FCC saw a possible benefit in creating a citizens radio service. This was originally thought to be something for small businesses to use, communicating locally. They were allocated space in the 450 to 470 megahertz range. Now, this was right after World War II. These were the frequencies they were using for radar during the war. Imagine trying to build an inexpensive and reliable transceiver out of tubes in 1948 that would work in the UHF band. The service just simply failed because they could not build the equipment and get it to work reliably. In 1958, another attempt was made. They opened up a Class D citizens band. It was created out of spectrum taken from the 11-meter ham bands, which created a significant amount of ill will from the ham community. And without hams to guide them, people got on and pretty rapidly, CB changed its character away from a family and business service to a anything goes, Wild West sort of communication world, where you had handles instead of call signs. People were putting linear amplifiers on these 5-watt transmitters, running them up to hundreds of watts, running up big antennas, beams, and actually doing DX when the sunspots were high. 10 meters is wide open. You could talk around the world on 10 meters, and also on 11 at certain times of the year. So people just had a ball with this, but it pretty much ruined the service for its original intent. Eventually, even the FCC gave up on trying to control anything but output power, and CB licensing itself was just thrown out the door on April 28th, 1983. I am N5RTF. Are there any questions? Do any of y'all use
Bravo 5 Delta for ID purposes? The Medical Amateur Radio Council grand rounds on the internet. Net control will be taking questions. There are currently no questions. We'll be breaking for ID within every 10 minutes and taking questions. So the discussion today on GMRS, and we're going to turn the mic back over to N5RTF for the discussion. Believe the discussion. Go ahead, Chip.
Does anybody here use GMRS? Does anybody use the family radio service?
I've used those in the past.
Okay, Andy Smith, WJ8B, has used the service, Chip, and I have also used GMRS one time, and just recently, and actually because of being hearing about it through you, I kind of got this lecture or this presentation of information in advance, and I found it fascinating. I hope everybody here today and that is also finding it fascinating. And what about you, Andy? How much have you used it over?
Well, I bought 2 of the UHF handhelds back in 2010, and primarily what we ended up having 3 of them. But what we used it for, my family would go on vacation, and my wife and I, and sometimes my adult children, would be hiking. And a couple of us were really heavily into serious photography with tripods and everything. So we would tend to lose each other. So we got these handhelds and utilized them and try to make sure people didn't go past the top of the mountain. And we were able to make sure we all knew where we were each at when we stopped to take a serious picture and somebody else wanted to go on ahead of us. So I still have those handhelds. They still work quite well. I haven't used them that much, but in recent years. But for the purpose,
Andy, what was your experience with the range?
Again, it's just like you said earlier. It was line of sight, and if you're on the same side of the mountain, you generally were okay. But if you went around a bend, that was there's earth between you and your person you're communicating with, they didn't work. So if you're on the same side of the mountain and usually you're able to communicate pretty well. It could be easily 2-3 miles, and never utilized it any further than that, though.
Do you know what power those particular units were running at that time?
I'm not sure, but I would guess they're probably 3 to 5 watts. So they were UHF, of course.
Okay.
Thank you for both of you, N5RTF and WJB, talking about the experience of using GMRS. One thing that I happened to notice when I was looking at some of the material is that they also make some self-contained repeaters that you can carry with you for situations like that where you're doing recreation. You can put this little repeater on top of the mountain and extend your range. I'm going to turn back to N5RTF to discuss this subject more. Go ahead, Chip.
Okay. So with the effective death of Citizens Band, the original idea, the original need for communications for families and businesses was still as valid as it had been in the beginning. So a licensed general mobile radio service oriented primarily toward these two markets was created in 1987 out of the old UHF CB band. Now, by 1987, it was possible to build relatively inexpensive and reliable handheld transceivers on UHF frequencies. So this time it worked. In 1996, Radio Shack jumped on board. If y'all can remember, at that time, Radio Shack was a real power player in the electronics world. And they actually got the FCC to agree to set up the family radio service band specifically so Radio Shack could sell radios. It turns out that a lot of other companies also began selling these UHF portable radios, and it became a very popular thing. If you go to a Walmart now, you will find what they call bubble pack radios, and these are family radio service transceivers, usually 0.5 watt or 2 watts, and they're pretty much plug and play. They have fixed antennas, and they really, it doesn't take anything but just putting the batteries in or charging the batteries, and then you can talk with your family. So those have really made this a popular band. Radio Shack doesn't really exist anymore as a significant factor in the electronics market, but their changes both in this and in computers are still, living today. They did a lot of good. So in 2017, with GMRS and Family Radio Service sharing some of the same channels, but at vastly different power levels, it became very confusing. And so the FCC went ahead and just did major revisions on both services. The way it currently stands, the way they changed it then and it is now, is that these two services, GMRS and Family Radio Service, share all 22 available channels. The radios are Part 95 type accepted, and depending on whether they're GMRS or FRS designated, they have different power levels, and they have different bandwidths, so that the two services can coexist and even talk to each other, but without significantly interfering with each other. The radios are forbidden, for example, in the case of Family Radio Service, they are forbidden from communicating on the repeater input frequencies for GMRS. So they cannot use the repeaters out of the box. Power is limited in FRS to 0.5 watt on channels 8 to 14, and 2 watts is the maximum on channels 1 to 7 and 15 to 22. All of the FRS units are handheld. They all have fixed antennas. If y'all can see, this is a GMRS. I mean, this is an FRS radio. You can tell because the antenna can't be removed. If it was a GMRS, it would have a screw-off antenna like we're used to on the handy talkies. This is a ham radio, but it's a TID radio, H3. They make an H3 and they make an H8, and I've got some of each of them. It's a newer model. It's particularly nice because if you see, it's got a UHF port on the bottom. You can use UHF to both program the radio, and you can also charge it from a standard USB connector in your car, or if you're traveling. This is the first ham radio I've had that you didn't have to have a dedicated charging kit with it everywhere you went. So I can charge it in my car. My point with this is that there is a GMRS model that looks exactly like this. The only difference is that it is programmed with the GMRS channels locked in, and the frequency, both the frequency, the power level, and also the bandwidth are fixed on the GMRS model. When it's unlocked to the ham model, you can do anything that you can with any other ham radio. Now, the question is, can you use a ham radio on GMS? The answer is no. It has to be Part 95 accepted. Ham radios are not type accepted. Can you use a GMRS radio on the ham band? Yes, you can unlock a GMRS radio and use it as a ham radio. Hams have been taking radios apart, from other services since the very beginning, and using, changing them, reconverting them, making them usable. All of our original repeaters were taken from the commercial market. All of the original ultra high frequency and VHF stuff came out of the commercial market.
I'm going to break here for a minute for a break for an ID here in 5RTF. This is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta. For ID purposes, the Medical Amateur Radio Council going around to the air net, and we'd like to have some questions for the presenter for Chip and 5RTF. Go ahead, and I'll make a list of those that would like to ask questions. Make your call to WB5D. Okay, we have a question from KN0S. Go ahead, Dave.
I just was wondering about the cost of those. I need family radios. That's what's very inexpensive, the bubble wrap that they call them. But what's the cost of those? Particularly if you add the cost of a repeater over.
Chip, did you catch that question?
I really couldn't understand that.
Well, the question is the cost of the GMRS radios and the repeaters. What kind of price range? And I know from personal experience that, and I think Chip was describing some of the radios with USB interfaces. The world's changing fast. The most recent GMRS radios I bought, the batteries were actually charged by a C connector. So, and we do live in the world of computing and software and for programming. The costs are very modest. N5RTF, not that we're doing any sales here on amateur radio, but would you like to describe the logistics from a standpoint of what's available in the marketplace?
Yeah, well, like anything else, you can spend as much as you want. They make GMRS radios that cost hundreds of dollars, but if you wait around and look for a sale, this radio here was about $30 with the antenna, with the battery, with everything that you need. And you can hold down one of the buttons, or two of the buttons, and turn the power on, and you can bring it up as a ham radio or as a GMRS radio, and it is type accepted. So you can get into business probably as little as $30 if you shop around. And these are good radios. These are high quality radios with up to about 5 watts of power. If you want to get up to the full GMRS power, you've got to have a mobile unit and a remote antenna. You don't want to put 50 watts right next to your head. Plus your batteries that only last milliseconds. So any other questions?
Any other questions for Chip? N5RTF, this is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta, AA4FLJ, the net control here from the Medical Amateur Radio Council. grand rounds on the internet. If you're not a Meta-Branch Radio Council member, that's fine. This net is intended for all amateur radio operators here on the public airwaves. So please go ahead and let us know your question, and we'll go ahead and make a list here to have the presenter answer. Go ahead and make your call to WP5. I'm not hearing any further questions this time. I'm going to turn the mic back over to 5RTF.
Okay, so remember, family radio service is a half a watt on channels 8 to 14, 2 watts on all of the channels, fixed antenna, and no repeaters. GMRS is limited to narrow band and a half a watt also on 8 to 14. So this is where GMRS and family radio service would normally talk to each other, although they can on other channels with caveats. GMRS can increase to 5 watts in wideband on channels 1 to 7, and up to 50 watts in wideband on 15 to 22, and on the repeater inputs. External antennas are allowed, mobile units are allowed, base stations are allowed. A license is required for GMRS. There's no license for family radio service. GMRS requires a no-test license, which now costs $35 and lasts for 10 years, and it includes your entire family. Okay, so
I can make a comment, please.
sure.
For a second. This is for a fellow here operating Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta. So I recently did purchase the license, and also you set it up through the core system. So it's the same system for renewing your FCC license now. And then as you go in and pick which radio service you want, you just pick the GMRS radio service and enter your information, pay your fee, and then you've got your core's registration for both your ham license and your GMR license. So I think it's very convenient for you to go ahead and do that. And although the two services aren't really directly related to each other, and I think our speaker might be talking about the potential to move up if you enter as a GMRS. I mean, I started as a shortwave listener in amateur radio, moved my way up to amateur radio. So whether or not this can be a gateway, I'm going to leave that to 5RTF to discuss them and turn the mic back over.
Okay, so for $35, you get a call sign for 10 years. You have to identify, such as this is N5RTF. Hams have to identify every 10 minutes, GMRS every 15. So there is a difference there. There are still some businesses that are grandfathered in on the GMRS frequencies, but they're very few, and as they fall out, they're not renewed automatically. So they're disappearing, and you probably will never run into one of them. Now, the term family has been defined clearly by the FCC to include the licensee's spouse, children, grandchildren, stepchildren, parents, grandparents, step-parents, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, and in-laws. All right, pretty generous. All right. Immediately somebody asked the question, can my girlfriend use my license? And it's almost always girlfriend, because just like ham radio, 90% of these GMRS licensees are going to be men. The answer, only if you're dating a family member. So, as far as the girlfriend's concerned, the answer is no. She does have the option to get her own license. She can stick with the FRS frequencies and power levels. She could go to CB. She could go to Muir's, which is another license-free service. Or you could get married to save the $35. Your choice. Any questions about that?
Any further questions of the material up to this point that we're discussing here? Again, this is a discussion amongst the amateur radio operators, so we encourage those of you here to add to the list of questions that you'd like to ask through the net control Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta and make your call now.
N4 TSC.
Okay, we have N4 TSC that would like to ask a question. Go ahead, Jerry.
Hi, Jerry.
Hi. I just would comment that while my children were growing up, we used what was available at the time. It was probably around 2000 or so when they 2005, 2010, somewhere in there. Whenever we made trips to places like Disney World or to New York City, when we had an issue where the children were just getting old enough to wander off, but were capable of being able to respond, I found that there was a sounding device that was included on the radios that we had, and you just push a button and it would make all the radio signal. And when they got out of view and we were concerned where they were, we would talk to them and say, okay, where are you now? And we would be able to deal with that. The only downside was one time we were traveling in the subway system of New Jersey to New York, and one of my kids had a slippery hand and dropped the radio, and it fell onto the tracks. And she said, "Go down there and pick it up." And I said, "Not on your life. I'm not risking my life for that radio." But in any case, it did kind of work and was helpful much of the time. And occasionally when I would go to ham fests like the one in Orlando or in Dayton, when there were a couple of people that we were trying to keep in contact with, we tried to use those radios rather than the standard amateur radio because we didn't want to interfere with the amateurs, because they would kind of use those particular radios or particular frequencies for talk-ins and so on. We didn't want to interfere with that. So basically, we were all walking around with 2 or 3 radios attached to our belts, and you had to kind of fumble and go, okay, which one is it now, in order to communicate. But that's the experience I had with them. I found that they were quite limited, and I just wonder about the enforcement of the rules, since the range is so limited that it's easy for people to try to take advantage of it and just say, okay, forget what the rules are, we'll just use the radio and hand it off. And at one time, I did try to match on one of my handhelds the frequency, because it was a little bit more reliable if you had a radio with a little bit more power. So we were probably running about maybe 10 watts or something like that in a handheld. And we were able to communicate more effectively that way. Those are just my comments. Back to you.
Yeah, and with a license, you can actually do that legally, but you still have to use the type approved radios. I was impressed with using a subway third rail as a charging device. That's that's overkill.
That was not the intention.
Okay. GMRS has an option to use repeaters. There are 8 designated pairs of inputs and outputs. There doesn't seem to be any organized coordination system like we have on the ham bands. So it's, again, it's first come, first serve. In most of the country, there are no repeaters. Out in rural areas, you're just not going to find a GMRS repeater. You can call up maps and see, but you'll see they're generally placed in urban areas and along interstate highways. Truckers use them. In some urban locations, all 8 repeater pairs, were used up long ago. And then, of course, you've got people who want to experiment, and you had people who decided to interconnect the series of repeaters by internet on up to a national basis. So you've got coast-to-coast communication on GMRS. They justified this by pointing to a section of the Part 95 rules that restricts connections through telephone lines to remote control only. They didn't mention the internet. This was 1987. So that was taken to mean that there was no restriction that you could use the internet. Well, that caused problems. It became an area of contention within the GMRS community. Some people liked talking DX. Others complained that there were no repeater pairs left in their area that weren't used up by these long distance conversations. They couldn't use the service for its original intent. They asked the FCC to step in, and this year the feds issued a written clarification stating at least twice in different terms that GMS repeaters may not be interconnected through, quote, any network, unquote. This includes the phone system, internet, private networks, even RF links that you own. They can still be used for remote control, like you can turn the repeater on and off if there's a problem, but you cannot transmit communication from one repeater to another over any other network. So that particular use of the service is rapidly disappearing. And again, I don't have a dog in the hunt, but a lot of people are expressing relief that the GMRS repeaters are back to local use again. Currently, there are about 300,000 licensed GMRS operators in the U.S. compared to 700,000 hams. And this itself is sort of misleading because if you remember, each GMRS license covers all your family. The radios are cheap. They're available anywhere. I've seen them for as low as $18. Potentially, GMRS users could outnumber hams 3 to 1 if everybody used their licenses to their maximum capability. Can you imagine all of the hams in the United States crammed into 22 channels? I see this, not as a problem, but as an opportunity. And I'll go into this a little deeper. But again, this is N5RTF. Are there any questions?
This is WB5D. We're taking a list for questions of N5RTF. Make your call. Any questions, make your call. Okay, no questions. Now, I do have a comment, Chip, N5RTF. So what you're talking about with GMRS would almost, we're looking at 20 meters right now with FT8. There's so many people trying to use it all at one time. And if you've ever looked at that waterfall, that's probably understated to the situation that N5RTF is describing. Since there are no further questions from on the air here, and then this is the Medical Amateur Radio Council Grand Rounds on the Air net, having a discussion, an interactive discussion, a group discussion about GMRS led by Chip N5RTF. And I'm going to turn the mic back over to Chip.
Yeah, this is always a problem as technology changes. The demand for a fixed, limited resource is constantly under pressure. So, whereas certain modes are falling out of favor and people are not using the areas allowed in the band plan, others are going to have to be expanded because the usage is so great at this particular time. So what are our opportunities at hams with this? Okay, first of all, GMRS operators are a large pool of people who have demonstrated their interest in radio. Some of them have demonstrated interest in DXing. They were willing to pay for a license and they were willing to pay for a radio. So that puts them at least halfway toward becoming a technician. All they need is training and encouragement. And it opens up an entire world of communication and 1,000 times as many frequencies as they have now, which is probably a good way to sell the service. Also, kids. The youngest age to get a GMRS license is 18. Now, you might be lucky and your father has one. But, if you were a kid and you were interested in radio and nobody wanted to get a GMRS license, you can get a ham license. The youngest that we've got on record are 8 years old with a ham license. I said the ham license is less expensive. Actually, it's the same now and lasts the same length of time. My local ham club has recognized, this market group of interested people, and they put up a GMRS repeater and they maintain it along with their 2-meter and 440 machines for purposes of disaster communications. In this area, it's hurricanes mainly, and to provide a less steep ramp to introduce people to licensed personal radio. So it's sort of a less painful way to get into talking to other people on a radio. It's less expensive, no test is required, and it makes sense. When I was 12 years old, my father and I built a C540 night kit CB transceiver on our kitchen table using a wood burning tool for a soldering iron. We had a license. It was KOR 5685. It was a family license. And that radio led to buying others and talking on CB, making friends. At 15, I got my first ham license and found out that hams despised CBers. So you pretty much had to hide the fact that you'd ever been on CB if you wanted to have friends in ham radio. Pretty sad way to welcome enthusiastic, new hams, particularly young people. I remember the same disparagement happened again when the code requirement was dropped. You remember people talking about, oh, no code hams, they're not real hams. Again, we just always find some way to screw things up. And we've got people who are interested in our hobby, and we find some way to ruin it for them. So now we have a third opportunity, and we really shouldn't repeat those kind of mistakes. If we see somebody on GMRS, we say, that's wonderful. You're interested in radio and all that. How would you like to have, instead of 22 frequencies, how would you like to have 10,000? Same cost, and I'll help you pass the test. Yes, that's the way we should be approaching these things. Also, it's important for hams to recognize that ham and GMRS services are not mutually exclusive. You can do both, all right? So just like using a family radio service radio or GMRS radio at a ham fest because the ham bands are being used up, or say on field day, it might be great to talk to your field day crew on GMRS because all of the ham bands are busy. My wife and I used family radio service handhelds in our house as an intercom. We bought a big house back in 1999, and she would be upstairs, I'd be downstairs or in the backyard, and we just kept a family radio service unit with each of us, and we would talk to each other on it rather than yelling up and down the stairs. Also, when we evacuated from Katrina, yes, I was a ham, but she was not. So we carried the FRS units in our 2 cars. And although we got separated on the road during the evacuation, we could talk to each other for several miles and plan our stops and get back together again. So you just never know when something like that is going to be useful and fit a need better than a ham radio would. It's not about having the perfect means of communication. It's about having access to multiple means of communication. There's nothing wrong with cell phones if the towers are up and they're not congested. But during a hurricane, it's nice to have 2 or 3 other ways to communicate. Also, again, think of the shallower ramp. Imagine using a test-free service to introduce your children or grandchildren to the fun of radio. You can just hand them a unit and teach them how to talk. They don't have to go through any testing or anything else. They're not going to run into people who are disparaging of them. They can just get on the air and play with a fairly harmless radio that's legal. And then if they finally like it, then move them on up the ladder. I would recommend that we individually and through our organizations like Marco and in the ARRL, we reach out to GMRS users and family radio service users and encourage them to join us. If only by listening at first. That's always a good thing to do. Many of these GMRS radios, though they're fixed in their transmit capability, they do have, some of them, general receive capabilities. They can actually listen to the ham bands. So you could unlock that capability and allow them to listen to hams. And the easiest way for you to get involved is just go ahead, spring for $35 and get a license for your family. Get a couple of cheap radios and get on the air. You'll meet some interesting people, and you can tell them you're a ham. And who knows, we may actually have, some new members through that route one day. So that's all my talk. I'm N5RTF, and I'm open for questions.
And for TSC,
Bravo 5 Delta, just take a list here for questions. I believe I don't know if N4TSC has a question, but let's get our list going first. We'll answer them in order. This is WB5D taking a list for questions of N5RTF. N4TSC, go ahead.
yeah, I just have N4TSC. I just have a couple of comments. I sort of experimented and dabbled in various different forms as time went on. And I found that when I started a residency in Detroit, I had moved to the city and I had a CB unit in my car. And I found that it was useful to me when I first got there as a precursor to GPS, because I would just get on the radio and say, listen, I'm trying to get to this particular place and I don't know how to get there. And there would be 2 or 3 people that would come on and they would tell me, oh yeah, go this direction and do this and so on. But what I found and I found I was sort of like plugged into a place that I didn't know. But then as time went on, I found that it was discouraging because there was a lack of discipline. And the discipline that exists in amateur radio did not exist in citizens band radio, and it became a loss, and I just let it slide. But I find it interesting, Chip, how you've been able to put together all of this information, because these are the kinds of experiences that I had, but you kind of codified it and put it in a logical order. I just wondered whether you did this on your own or whether you did some research in order to put it all together, because I find it fascinating as you pulled everything together now. Back to you, N4TSC.
Well, thank you, but Google is my partner in just about everything I do these days. I looked up a lot of it. Jay put together the pictures. So the pictures that you were looking at, Jay put together and put on the internet. But I did some research. Some of it was just personal experience going back all the way to, let's see, that would have been 1965. Yeah. So that was when I really first started learning about electronics. And that was during the transition from tubes to solid state. And I'm amazed now that I'm still alive, because I got shocked quite a few times on old tube circuits, taking them apart, putting them back together, building stuff. But it was good to be a kid then, and the parts were big enough to see. You could actually work with them. I feel sorry sometimes, for kids now who are just putting together boards because the surface mount parts are so small that you have to have an operating microscope to even solder them. So they don't have that excitement of, putting a 5-watt resistor, into a tube socket and letting the smoke out. And 5 RTF.
You could probably still have the opportunity of introducing kids to radio. The way I was introduced to it was I got a crystal radio set by a kit, and I put it together, and I hooked one part of the set to the pipes in the house, and got the crystal to generate just enough, and you could hear the very high power AM radio stations very easily. And that was what my introduction to it was, and I think it was probably about 10 or 11 years old.
Yeah, I think a lot of us built crystal radios. My problem was selectivity. I was, pulling in more than one station at a time. The headphones, those Hi-Z headphones, you can't find those things anymore. There's one company, I think, that makes a little earplug that you can use for crystal radios, but there's, the headphones are the limiting factor these days.
You're right.
Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta here for ID. Any further questions here from 5 RTF? I'll continue to make the list. Make your call to NWB5D, the club call to the Medical Amateur Radio Council, and the NIC control today. Personal call is AA4FLJ here operating out of North Central Florida, Houghton, Florida. Make your call for further questions. Well, thank you, Chip. I don't hear any further questions, but thank you for an absolutely fascinating discussion. As Chip had mentioned, images, so being the vagaries of 20-meter propagation and the changes in the life cycle not always meeting the solar cycle, in terms of our members as they move to different locations in the country, as they move on in their lives into different stages of their life, they don't always have access to 20 meters. So we do a Zoom simulcast here. And that will also be available for anybody that would like to view it or share it, because it should be recorded and will be made into a YouTube video, and that will be available. I believe the YouTube channel is at Healthcare Hams. So that would be YouTube / at the @ at Healthcare Hams. And that should be up later today. So these discussions not only are a net on 20 meters, but we also, through technology, are finding the way to extend them to those without 20-meter propagation or 20-meter equipment, and also to the general public. So that, as Chip was mentioning, also with crystal radios and being there at the transition from tubes to transistors in 1965, 1966, the Medical Amateur Radio Council, that's when it was formed. 1965, the first organization meeting. 1966 was actually formed. We are an ARRL affiliated club, for those of you that are listening here on the air. We're open to all amateur radio operators. It's not limited to people in healthcare fields, although you might think from healthcare hams we are. But everyone is interested in healthcare, whether you're interested in, for yourself as a patient, or the ham radio connection between the two. It's not medical advice, but just like we found today's discussion to be of general interest. Some of the health-related topics that we discuss are also of general interest. So thank you for joining us for that today, and kudos and thank you to Chip and 5 RTF out of Nolans here, out of NOLA, leading us in a wonderful discussion. He's one of many presenters that present their life experiences, both in health and amateur radio, to our organization. Any further questions with that knowledge now? I'll take a list. Any further questions for N5 RTF? Make your call with WB5D. Okay, with no further questions, I'm going to bring our net to a close for today. We do have a medical topic, a health-related topic, getting ready for Thanksgiving next week on salmonella. And of course, the impact on food from salmonella. I think we'll probably have a smile from Chip, because he probably is thinking about it in the reptilian fashion, but we also have that in the turkey fashion. I personally was ignorant when I was younger and did not properly prepare turkeys and suffered the consequences at every Thanksgiving since I was the one that had properly defrosted the turkey. So I think you'll find that discussion next week to be fascinating. Some of the further discussions for the next 3 months, our Ether publication will be coming out approximately October 1st. It's a quarterly publication. If you're not a member of Marco, you can find them on marco-ltd.org on the internet. You can also use the contact information on Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta and my personal call AA4FL to email us through the connections there, through the listings there to get that information about the publications. But the list of the next 3 months topics is published 3 months in advance, or a month in advance of the first one, but certainly all 3 months are laid out. We have some fascinating discussions going on next quarter. We have Veterans Day coming up. Usually we'll honor our veterans, and we'll pick a subject, or Armistice Day. It's related to medical care advances that were made through military service. I think you'll find that quite interesting, as well as many other interesting topics, both health related and ham radio related. So please look for that Ether publication through the information I just described, and don't hesitate to join the Medical Image Radio Council if you'd like to. We do have a Google group. All that joining information is there on the internet on our website, and we also have a new website coming up at healthcarehams.org. That might be a little easy to remember, but as our presenter Chip said, Google is only a keystroke away, or a few keystrokes away, and we've got the oracle of the internet. Think of the power we have through the oracles, not just Google, but just the internet in general. Imagine yourself, for those of us like Chip and I that were growing up in the 1960s, and some of you in the 1950s, imagine the impact of the future of your professional and personal lives had those young inquisitive minds had access to the internet in a proper fashion. Think of the brilliance that would have ensued. Hopefully we all would have been in health related or engineering related careers, but you never know. Hindsight's 2020. But on that line of thought, think about the impact you can have on young people now, because now they have access to the internet, but what they're lacking is the contextual foundation to be able to make a connection with the real world. And that's where these discussions come in very helpful, and that's why we make YouTube videos to share. And this is AA4FLJ in Hawthorne, Florida, net control for the Medical Amateur Radio Council. Our club calls WB5D, an affiliated ARL club. Thank you for all amateurs allowing us the privilege of using this frequency every Sunday for our net. We hope you find value, and all amateurs find value in it. And we look forward to connecting you and perhaps eyeball QSOs at the many hand fests that we attended as a group. I'm going to return the frequency, the general frequency, to the amateur community. And thank you once again until next week. This is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta AA4 FL the mic saying 7-3.
WB1FF5, WB1FF5, Barry, W2.
And we're going to turn this back over to the general W2 Papa Japan. Let me just get a second here to do a little bit of housekeeping, and then we will go ahead and let you guys have contact. Just 1 second.